We're going to hear now from somebody who I did not hear before. Brian Faulkner spoke at Salt Spring, and he blew them away. I really regret missing it, but the good thing is we're going to hear him tonight. Brian is with the Raincoast Conservation. He spent 35 years on the sea, skippering a legendary schooner called the Maple Leaf. And he's here to tell us just a little bit about his experiences and what he's learned. Brian.
What I'm here to share tonight is a little bit of my experience on the coast of 35 years of just an intense privilege of being able to explore the wilderness and to share that with a whole bunch of people whose lives, like mine, it changed. It's an extreme pleasure to be speaking alongside of Elizabeth, one of the heroines of the battles on this coast for many decades, protecting the places that we love. I saw Vicky tonight and Misty, and these are the heroines in my life. These are people who have really changed my life and deepened my commitment to standing up for this place that we all love. So what I want to talk about tonight is a little bit about the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline. Some of you probably haven't heard of that. As a mariner at Raincoast, we were invited by EcoJustice, a fine legal firm that represents us in a number of instances. We were asked to be an official intervener in the judicial or the joint review panel hearings into this pipeline. And we mobilized an incredible force at Raincoast to compile a huge amount of evidence into that process. One of the things that we did was we took a look at the risk analysis, and I was asked to take part in that. And my experience on the coast was what was used largely to sort of test this risk analysis that they had done. And I expected to see flaws in it, but I was actually astounded at the misrepresentation, the level of misrepresentation in this process. So what I will talk about tonight is that process. I want to give a little small bit of background on Raincoast and our experience on the coast and us as an organization, just to give you an idea why it is that we were asked to do this. Raincoast is an organization that primarily has been involved in science, and when I sold the business Maple Leaf, we'd always had a great relationship with Raincoast, and I was asked to set up the Marine Operations Program, and this is our research vessel Achiever. We developed the capability to work in this area, in this very, very remote area of the Great Bear Rainforest. For 2 decades, it's been the area that has been the focus of all of our work. This is our field station on Denny Island in the community of Bella Bella. So this is what the Great Bear Rainforest looks like. So it is an incredible remote area, convoluted shorelines, thousands of little islands, bays, thousands and thousands of kilometers of shoreline, steep, rugged coastal mountains, big, long, deep fjords, with these spectacular river estuaries at the end of them. And it's in those river valleys that just all of the life of the coast is. It's where the salmon come to spawn, and it's where all of the wildlife values. It's stunning temperate rainforest, much of it protected by huge efforts of just an incredible environmental community that just wouldn't say no. Excuse me. Beautiful temperate rainforest, fabulous rivers, full of salmon. Some of the healthiest runs that remain on the coast of British Columbia remain in this area. And everything is connected, as Arthur said, and everything waits for the salmon. On this coast in the spring, it's about the herring, but for the winter, for the fall and the winter, it's all about the salmon. And everything depends on the salmon. All of the wildlife, hundreds of species on the coast depend on salmon. We are an organization that has focused on science for the simple reason that resource decisions and development decisions in British Columbia are made always in the absence of information. In the absence of information, or of only anecdotal information, which is often discredited, these resource developments go ahead. It's certainly not the intention of the government to facilitate this kind of research, and certainly not to fund it. So we developed our own capacity to do this research, and we partnered with all kinds of institutions and even government organizations, which are in the process of being hollowed out at the moment. But we worked to gain that information, to collect the information that's required to make informed decisions about these resources and about these developments and what's required. So this is Dr. Paul Paquette. Paul is the senior scientist at Raincoast and the mentor of all of the other scientists that work with us. This is Dr. Chris Darramont. Chris is over there on the camera tonight. And one of those great Raincoast scientists, mentored by Paul initially, and now working out of his lab at University of Victoria. And these are the brilliant people that have worked so hard and with so little resources to collect this information. Chris began a wolf project, I think, in 2001, one of the longest running research projects on carnivores on this coast. Continues in a different iteration today. And some of the most incredible knowledge of these, what Chris refers to as marine mammals, has come from that research. And an understanding that these animals, as much as bears, depend on salmon and probably wouldn't survive without salmon. But all that is just a bit of background on Raincoast and what we've done and what we've been. What we're really engaged in now is probably the fight of our life and the fight of every environmentalist and every citizen of British Columbia to protect this coast. These things, these giant oil carriers, exist everywhere in the world. This does not. This exists here because the others don't exist here. This is from Prince William Sound. This is what happens if they come here. We set out when we first heard about this rumors of pipelines coming to Kitimat and tankers on the coast. We set out, I said last night, I did a presentation on Pender Island, I said 6 years ago. It's actually nearly 10 years ago that we set out to collect some of this primary science, this information about what's at stake here. And using Achiever and an incredibly dedicated group of people who spent up to 3 months at a time with me on this boat, standing in that platform from early March to mid-December, back and forth across Hecate Strait, Dixon Entrance, Queen Charlotte Sound. Tens of thousands of miles each year in the fourth roughest body of water in the world, back and forth on these transects. That's 2 years of the 5 years that we did. We gathered sightings of cetaceans. Because this area is such a rough body of water and there's so little traffic in that area, there wasn't that much known. We knew it was a very rich area, but we had no idea. We gathered tens of thousands of sightings of every species of cetacean. These are some interesting stories. The humpback whales in the last picture have been recovering on this coast for the last 15 years. I've had the pleasure of seeing that in my lifetime. Fin whales were hunted almost to extirpation. They're starting to make a very fragile recovery, right smack in the white line of the tanker route, of the proposed tanker route. On one of our transects, we encountered 26 fin whales in one day, just starting to get their feet on the ground or their fins wet. And marine birds, tens of thousands of sightings of marine birds. We collected the largest distribution, the largest database of at-sea distribution of seabirds in the world. It was an ambitious project, again, with very little resources. We gathered that information so that when this process came up, which we didn't even know what the process was going to be, but we knew there was going to be a decision made about this. We didn't know about the Joint Review Panel, but we were prepared for it. And the report that came from that study, the What's at Stake report, forms the basis of a lot of First Nations evidence in this process. So we feel pretty good about having gathered that. But what I'm here to talk about tonight primarily is none of that. What I'm here to talk about is what Enbridge has proposed is the real risk of tanker traffic on the coast. They have proposed that once in 15,000 years, this could happen. This is from the Exxon Valdez. Most of us can remember that. It's not 15,000 years ago. Not anywhere close. What I want to talk about is the risks, the real risks, of what's involved with marine navigation and particularly crude oil tankers on this coast. The sea is a conspiracy against safe travel. There are two things that conspire to produce catastrophic marine incidents. One is the power of the sea, the ever-changing, ever-unpredictable, sudden power of the sea. And the second is our own humanness. We cannot escape our humanness. And no matter what, as these endeavors get huge, most of you can recognize this ship. This was the Costa Concordia. This is in everybody's memory. It was only a few months back. What could be more human than having your girlfriend up on the bridge, wanting to impress her a little bit, wanting to go in a little closer to wave hello to an old colleague? So all of that technology that we put our faith in gets turned off momentarily because we're human. A drunken captain, as Arthur points out, runs a huge tanker onto a reef, onto a well-marked reef. So all of these things are a conspiracy against safe travel of this, safe transport of this really, really toxic product. So Enbridge's quantitative risk analysis, they were supposed to quantitatively identify the marine risks, the probability of those risks occurring, and the consequences of those risks. So this is from their statement. This is where the 15,000 years comes from. And so they're talking about a rather large spill, 40,000 cubic meters, not anywhere close to even the size of the Exxon Valdez. But they concluded that the risk was once in 15,000 years, the mitigated return period. My father had an expression that he used. He called a lot of things unmitigated bullshit. And that's what instantly popped to my mind when I first saw that. So I set out to look at this risk analysis and deconstruct this mathematical model that they put together that produced this magic number of once in 15,000 years. What they said, the first thing that they said was that there's no tanker traffic in British Columbia. So therefore we can't use British Columbia shipping statistics. There's no local data available. We have to use global transport of oil statistics. The database that they used was incomplete and only available if we paid $28,000 to get the real data. But they ignored all of the shipping that takes place in the very area that they want to build this tanker route and that they want to pass these tankers through. This is from the Enbridge report. This is the exclusion zone, and this is why there haven't been spills on this coast. There's no data because there's been no tankers. And as long as there continues to be no tankers, no problem. We won't build a database for them. But there are shipping incidents on this coast, and they're worth looking at. This was the Queen of the North, another very, very human situation. A discussion of some sort on the bridge. Distractions. And that's the result. If that was a tanker, the result would have been infinitely more horrific. This is a bulk carrier coming out of Kitimat called the Petersfield. This was only a couple of years ago. Its rudder stuck hard over. It turned sharply, and in the narrow channel, Douglas Channel, smacked right smack into the north side of the channel. Had that been a 370,000-ton tanker full of diluted bitumen, that would have been catastrophic. It happens. Another local shipping incident in Prince Rupert Harbor, about the same time. Big winds, 50, 60 knots of wind. The ship tried to escape from the confines of the harbor. Couldn't make the turn, went aground, was hung up on a rock with half of the ship extending out over the rock, hanging in the air. Had that been a crude carrier, it probably would have broken in half. So some of the other assumptions that they put into this risk model, and I'm trying to help people understand how they came up with once in 15,000 years. You simply take this little piece of route that is convoluted and in very, very wild situations, and you compare it to the thousands and thousands of miles of open ocean voyages of all of the tanker traffic in the world. And so you dilute this little 110-mile stretch and all of the hazards it contains by all of the places in the world where an accident never happened. Pretty good trick. So this is the proposed tanker route, and what you see on the left there is the existing shipping on the coast. It gives you a bit of an idea of the size of those very large crude carriers, bigger than the largest cruise ships that we have on the coast here, carrying 2 million barrels of one of the most toxic substances that's ever been transported in ships. And this is Douglas Channel. This is one of the wide parts of Douglas Channel. Over 9 miles of it is less than 1.5 miles wide. One of the other techniques that they used in the risk analysis was this magic tool of averaging. Does it matter that an incident, a catastrophic incident with a ship happened in conditions that were above average? Of course not. If you're assessing risk, shouldn't you assess the most extreme conditions? And throughout this risk analysis, that magic tool of averaging was used to present a very, very diminished risk. You can actually lend your safety from one area to another. What they did was break this route down into segments, 40-mile long segments. And they got together a group of coast pilots, about 6 coast pilots, 2 guys from Transport Canada, 2 guys from Norway, and an Enbridge observer. Over coffee and donuts, they sat down for one whole day and classified these according to world averages. Were these 1.4 times more dangerous than world averages? This one was 0.65. This one was about 0.9. And this one was 1.4 times more dangerous than all of the other places in the world where tankers go. No justification for that, no backup, no documentations, just a dozen guys sitting around over coffee and donuts. So then you mush them all back together, and you take the one that's 1.5 times more dangerous than the average around the world, and you mush it with the one that's only half as dangerous around the world, and you come up with the end result, at the end of the day, that this is just pretty average. A pretty average place to run tankers. So then you take all of those hundreds of millions of miles of tanker routes, and you compare them to the number of incidents, and that's how you come up with once in 15,000 years. They actually only came up with 5,000 years, but that was the unmitigated risk period. What they said is, we can make it better than that. We can make it much safer. We can mitigate those risks. And a couple of the prominent ones that they say will mitigate those risks is tethered tugs. And again, without any supporting documentation, without any discussion, they just simply said that it's 3 times safer. So we multiply the 5,000 years by 3. And that's how we come up with 15,000 years. I've heard them even quote 10 times safer. So, it could have been even better. It could have been 50,000 years. However, 15,000 years is since the last ice age. So I guess they figured that was probably enough. One of the things that you understand about tethered tugs is one of the ways that they decided would mitigate these risks, is that there are quite a few incidents around the world involving tethered tugs, including this one in Prince William Sound, which was again a very human experience. It was Christmas Eve. They just let go of their tanker and were heading home Christmas Eve. And they ran into Bligh Reef, the same reef that the Exxon Valdez hit. A sister ship of this ran into Serpent Point, just south of Bella Bella. In very beautiful conditions, in the middle of the night, ran into a point that was marked by a light. But this is one of the best examples of what can happen with a tethered tug. This is the Esso Bernicea. This took place at one of the terminals in Scotland that is referred to in the report as one of these paragons of safety that occur in Northern Europe. She was tying up to a berth at Sullomvo in Scotland in about 40 to 50 knots of wind, something that occurs about once a week in Kitimat. And the tethered tug that was helping it berth had a fire and an explosion. And they had to cut loose of the tug, or of the tanker. The tanker slammed in the wind into the dock and spilled 11,000 tons of crude oil into this beautiful fjord in Scotland. One of the other factors that they say mitigates the risk is double hulls. This is an example of a double hull. It was T-boned by another boat. This one in Singapore Straits. These are very, very recent examples. One of the things that we understand is that double hulls are an experiment. They're very, very recent innovation. And they have their problems. Between these two incidents, this is Port Arthur, Texas, this was in 2010, this is only a year and a half ago, 4.6 million liters of crude oil were spilled in these two spills. So one of the other things that they did, now, in order to assess the mathematical model, the risk model, I had to get some help because I'm not a mathematician. But what I have done for 35 years is sit in wheelhouses up and down this coast listening to the weather. And if anybody knows the weather on this coast, I know the weather on this coast. Looking through this, I read these statements and I was astounded. I looked through the data and I was more astounded. And I went, how can this be? The data that they presented just didn't match my experience, and it didn't even come close to matching my experience. They recorded the weather for 15 years, from 1990 to 2005, at 5 of the weather buoys on the coast, continuous data for 15 years. And they presented those in tables. And the maximum value that I could see on those tables in 15 years for these 5 buoys, which were in North Hecate Strait, South Hecate Strait, West Dixon Entrance, and this one that's the star, West Sea Otter, and Nanakwa Shoal out of Kitimat. The highest wind that they recorded or presented was 24 meters per second. Does anybody know what that is? No, most people don't think it. That's 48 knots. That's a good sail in the Gulf of Georgia. It's not a great sail in Hecate Strait, trust me. But it's half of what I've experienced on great regularity. So I went, how did they do this? How did they come up with that? Well, they chose a way of expressing things that, in this report, completely lowers the numbers and diminishes the risks. This is the wave height from that single buoy, West Sea Otter, and this is 1 month. This is March of this year. So the red is what Enbridge says. This is what Enbridge puts in the report. This is what's called a significant wave height. I had to look the definition up. It's not something that you really encounter. You encounter the big waves, the real waves. The statistical waves, you don't worry about. But if you look at that, 10.2 meters was the maximum that they recorded in that month. But what really happened was waves that were 26 meters. That's different. And that was done with the wind. 48 knots was the maximum wind that they encountered or that they recorded in 15 years. I've sat and listened as the winds at North Hecate Strait went to 103 knots. Cape St. James, the lighthouse at the bottom end of Haida Gwaii, went to 105 knots. But it was presented in such a way that there's really not that much risk here. And this gives you an idea of the seasonal distribution of that, which again, in the presentation of these figures, you don't get an idea of. The mean through the wintertime is mean. The summertime is pretty nice. So what does that really mean in terms of weather? Well, I found this, and I just wanted to share this with you. What this is a tanker. This is not in Northern Europe. This is in the North Pacific. So this is what it means. The weather is not so bad. No worse than Northern Europe. And what does that mean for ships? There are colleagues of mine who have shared this coast with me as long as I have tonight. A couple of them have introduced themselves to me tonight, and I haven't seen them for a long time, and it's just a real pleasure to be here among people who have been on this coast for this long. But what weather like this translates to is disaster. This is when you start to have structural failure on a huge tanker. This is when things start to break. Engines quit. And disaster happens. This is a classic example of this. This is the MV Brer. Left Mongstad in Norway into a really big storm. They pulled the pilots off a little early because they weren't going to be able to get them off at the pilot station. It encountered seas, probably something similar to that, no worse than here, and lost its power. And despite the fact that there was a very large tug nearby and a huge trawler, they couldn't get lines to the ship. The ship drifted up in the south end of the Shetland Islands, one of the most beautiful places on the coast in Europe, and very similar to a lot of the places here, rich, rich, rich with seabirds and marine life. 85,000 tons, its entire cargo spilled into the Shetland Islands. You can see the black wave going ashore there. It does happen here. This was only less than a month ago. This was one of our raw log ships, shipping raw logs off to the east. Is there a theme here? It encountered weather off the north end of Vancouver Island. And the crew was afraid for their lives. They couldn't evacuate the ship. They were terrified. The logs shifted, there was damage to the ship, and they almost lost the ship. That's exactly the same route as these crude oil tankers will ply. The presentation of one of the other hazards on the coast was equally as deceptive. Visibility is really important. Having sat and done a lot of navigation in thick, thick fog, it's not comfortable. And having sat and waited for days at a time in fog, they acknowledge that navigation in fog in visibility less than 2 kilometers or nautical mile is really problematic for tankers. But in this report, it said that the fog is well forecast and generally only lasts for periods of a couple of hours. Is that anybody's experience here? It certainly isn't mine. I've sat in Kitsaway Anchorage for 2 days trying to find the front end of a 90-foot ship. It just doesn't happen. And it was the way that they were presented, the fact that the statistics weren't even from the tanker route because there are no visibility stations there, and the fact that fog rolls in and out. And if it happens to roll out for a few minutes, then it interrupts that period of 2 days. But what does that mean again for navigation of tankers? As much as fog is very beautiful above bridges, it's not so great below the fog. This was the Costco Busan, again, less than 2 years ago, coming out of San Francisco in the thick fog. Enbridge has said they'll schedule their arrivals of these tankers around the fog. Yeah, I think that's going to happen? I don't think so. So this is what happened. The captain was impaired on prescription drugs. They hit the bridge abutment. They didn't stop and wait for the fog to clear. With the best navigation equipment in the world and the best nav aids on land in a highly populated, highly traveled area, they ran into the bridge. And that's what happened. And this was only his fuel tanks. This was 6,000 gallons. This wasn't 2 million barrels. Throughout this risk analysis, they keep alluding to Northern Europe, these terminals, and the Kitimat terminal will be built to the highest standards like the ones in Northern Europe. And the navigation will be as safe as has taken place for decades in Northern Europe. They mention a few of them: Solomvo in Scotland, Mongstad in Norway. Modern terminals accompanied with nice pictures of reassuring industrial order. They left one out. They said there were none on this coast that they could compare them to. Well, they left out the one in Prince William Sound, not that far from where we're going to do this. This is Port Valdez. So in the end, looking at how all of these statistics were put together, I thought, how can we look at this? If I was a First Nations person who depends most of my life and most of my diet depends on the sea, if I was a commercial fisherman and my livelihood depended on the sea, if I was an ecotour operator, what would I want to know about this project? So I thought, well, let's look at these terminals that they're talking about. What happens when you build one? What is the record? What does once in 15,000 years really translate to on the ground? Or on the water in this case. So I looked around and I did a little research at Solomvo in Scotland. First disaster in its first year of operation. Mongstad in Norway. Its first disaster 4 years after it commenced operation. Port Valdez, one they didn't mention. First disaster was the Exxon Valdez, 12 years after it opened up. They didn't mention Milford Haven. It was one that was alluded to. It's in Northern Europe. It's one of those super modern ones. Its first disaster, the first ship that called, exploded, caught fire, and sank, and its entire cargo spilled into the sea. So this is the record. In fact, of all of the ones that I researched, the longest was Port Valdez, 12 years. Something slightly less than 15,000 years. So what are the consequences of this? So what we wanted to do was give people an idea of the area that's affected by a spill. Now this is not a scientific, and I really have to disclaim this really quickly, because what we did was we simply took the area affected by the Exxon Valdez. And this was published by the Exxon Valdez Cleanup Trust, a division of the Alaska government. And this is the area that the Exxon Valdez oil covered. So we simply slid that down the coast and put it over the coast. We centered it on Camano Sound, one of the places where we thought might be most likely for a spill. So if you look at an Exxon Valdez size spill, it has the potential to cover an area that would go down both sides of Vancouver Island as far as Campbell River, all the way up to Prince of Wales Island and Doll Island in southeast Alaska, all of the inlets of the Great Bear Rainforest, both sides of Haida Gwaii. And so that's an area that could be affected, and these are the kinds of effects that it has. These are the kind of horrific things that occur as a result of a spill. This is an ancient murrelet. Over 80% of the world's population of ancient murrelets nest on some tiny little islands on the east coast of Haida Gwaii. The potential at certain times of the year is to wipe out huge portions of these populations with slow, agonizing deaths. Even a small amount of oil can kill otters and can kill birds. So what happens after all the hand-wringing and the finger-pointing is that they try and clean things up. These cleanups are often as destructive as the spill itself. In the case of the Exxon Valdez, it's considered that there was almost as much damage done during the cleanup as there was from the spill. High-pressure hoses and steam was used to make the oil go away down into the substrate. Meanwhile, boiling and killing every living thing on the beaches. So I found another little thing here that I just want to show you.
Okay, see the canvas? This entire area, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of acres. They put this canvas over the top of it, and then they planted grass seed underneath it, and this grass. Just again showing you the canvas that they put over the top of this entire area, and then you see the grass will grow through. Do you see how it grows through? That's what happened in this entire area. See? It's the whole area is like that. It's all through here, everywhere. That's how they cover it up. Now, this is 100% proof. It doesn't make any logical sense to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to plant grass over the top of something that you're going to redig up. They didn't expect me to come out here and make them redig this up. Alright, so you see how this all bounces right all in here? Can you see that?
Yeah.
The whole thing, it's all oil. They put that canvas over it, you cut around in a circle.
You feel this whole thing is shaking when you do that.
Yep.
The whole ground is shaking.
Cut in a circle. And this whole area is just, it's all oil mixed with mud. It's all,
Oh my God.
goes all the way down.
Oh my God.
Stay back a little bit so we can get a shot.
Yeah.
So
And this is how they
that's
cover
what
it
the
up.
cleanup is. That's Enbridge. So
and it's
if you
all
have a
through
pipeline
here.
spill, they're the ones who are going to be cleaning it up. Doesn't build a lot of confidence in me. One of the other things that's really important is that Enbridge has no liability for this oil. Once it comes out of this terminal into the tankers, it's not their oil anymore. Maybe that's a good thing. On the other hand, most of the bill for cleaning up the Exxon Valdez has been footed by the US taxpayers. So we could look forward to that too. So this is from a study that was done 20 years after the Exxon Valdez and published just last year. Otters are still dying. They're picking the mussels off the rocks, and the oil is still embedded in the byssal threads of the mussels. They get a little bit of oil on their fingers, they preen their fur, and they break down the insulation, and they die of hypothermia. 21 years later, this is how deep you have to go into the substrate on the beaches to find crude oil. Comments in the report said they found lots and lots of oil that was as undegraded as it was when it spilled 21 years ago. So what you understand is that the profits will go to these companies, and the losses and the costs will go to us. Nassim Taleb said it really well. What's at stake with these tankers? Most of all, an ancient way of life with First Nations on the coast. It's a place of unimaginable health and spectacular beauty. This is the partial death toll from the Exxon Valdez. This is the known death toll. 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, 300 seals, 250 bald eagles, 2 whole matrolines of killer whales, billions of herring and salmon eggs, and 2 commercial fisheries that still, 20 years later, have not recovered. And every living invertebrate on thousands of beaches and foreshores, all through Prince William Sound. What wasn't studied was some of the icons of our coast, the impact. Chris's research project has already shown in 3 short years how completely tied to the salmon runs and the health of the salmon runs reproduction is in grizzly bears. How many bears did we lose because of the Exxon Valdez? We don't know. How many wolves? How many dolphins? How many humpback whales? What we did lose was thousands of sustainable jobs. And that's what's at stake here, is a fishing industry that is a couple of 100 years old. What's especially at stake is sustainable jobs in these very remote communities that depend on bear viewing and wildlife viewing and whale watching. Bear viewing is really expanding on this coast, and particularly in communities like Hartley Bay, communities that had 85% unemployment that now have jobs that they love in a very remote community without cutting anything down and exporting it or digging it up and exporting it. The spirit bear alone has brought tremendous prosperity to this village relative to what they had before. What's really at stake is our children's future. The lifespan of this project is much longer than my own. I won't see the end of this project. I'm 60 years old now. This is my niece. She's 5 years old now. She means everything to me. I want her to be able to see the things that I've seen in the incredible privileged life that I've had, in the places that I've been able to travel on this coast, and just the magnificent pieces of nature that have been revealed to me. I want those to be there for her. I look forward to showing them to her. But this is a choice that we must make, and we have to make it now. Joe Oliver has even shortened the process. And so this is the choice that we have, because it will happen. If you take anything home from me tonight, I hope it's an understanding that the risk is real, that it's not a question of if, it is a question of when. And when won't be 15,000 years. It will happen in my niece's lifetime. And this coast, the coast that she inherits, could suffer this. This is the coast that she sees now, and that's what I'd like her to see. One of the things that really heartens me is how many people have really started to get this. This issue has become a proxy in this country for the fight for democracy. And people, conservative people in my life that I never thought would be as involved as they are getting up off the couch. First Nations are utterly committed to this. We had the great pleasure of being in Bella Bella for the hearings for 3 days, the shortened hearings where they were frightened by this horde of school children. They had to cancel a hearing for fear of their lives. Woyala, the head chief, said it very beautifully. He said, these people are not scared. He said, they're worried. And what they're seeing at every one of these hearings in these First Nations communities up the coast is people committing to this. Communities all across, groups of people, professional people, getting up and saying no to this. One of the projects that we have this summer, a group of 50 of the very prominent artists on this coast, including Robert Bateman, are going to come up into the coast. We're taking them up there, and they're producing works of art, which they will donate to this campaign. We're producing a book. We have tremendous support from the communities up the coast, from the lodges, from Hakai Beach Institute, from the Spirit Bear Lodge in Klemtu, are going to put up these artists. And we'll be launching the book in September or October, and starting the traveling art show in the first week in November. So stay tuned for that. But it's an example to me of how all kinds of different organizations, all kinds of different people, all aspects of society are standing up to this and saying, no, this is the coast that we stand for. This is the coast that we want. I hope you'll join. Thank you very much. Thank you. That is what gives me hope. Thank you.